There was basically a research team that was doing a study on Bitcoins, and in particular for a lot of the ransomware that we're seeing, propagating on the internet today.
They came up with some interesting numbers. The reason any of these cryptocurrencies or Bitcoins they're very easy to create, anyone can walk out. There's no proof of identification. I can go and create it. And the second thing is, once the transfer has been made, there's no revert back. Right. Once the money is gone, it's gone.
Once it's gone, yeah, so that you can't reverse the transaction, which is one of the things that I guess some bank transactions can be reversed once they found that there's something bad going on.
Exactly.
But in this case, you can't reverse it.
You can't revert back. Yeah. And I think the third most important thing with these hackers is it's very easy to cache the Bitcoins. I believe these three things actually that made that darling to the hackers to use the Bitcoin, in addition to anonymous networks being used in this case.
Yeah. So these criminals, they ultimately want to go buy some thingamajiggy like a Lamborghini, or a fancy car. Yeah. And so if they want to go buy a fancy car, they can't go into most dealers with Bitcoin. And in fact, a lot of places aren't even willing to take cash because they know that if somebody's paying for one of those cars in cash, it's probably dirty money. Yeah. And so it's at least frowned upon. Perhaps in some countries you can get away with it more than others. But anyway, I distracted you. Go ahead and continue.
No, I mean, in this study, actually, what they found is basically they keyed on about 34 different ransomware families.
Yeah.
I think about 150 binaries. They started with, I think slowly they ramped up to 310,000 binaries.
Wow, just a few.
Just
310,000. So there's different versions or different iterations of the...
I think there are lots of binaries are in play because they want to evade the AV detection.
Yeah.
Probably that's what it is.
Yeah, that's basically a well-known fact that as antivirus is able to catch up with the signatures, they're generally and they're trying to outrun the antivirus to be able to basically do the ransom, and then they don't really care if it gets detected after that's already been done.
It's primarily comprised of 10 malwares, but the top two are Cerber and the other one is the Locky. I think Locky is the first $1 million club ransomware they've seen it.
And that's you get an award for getting into that club?
You get a Lamborghini.
Maybe multiple Lamborghinis. When a victim has to pay the Bitcoin, they has to go to some exchange and get the money. And most of the victims, they preferred, I think it has actually a very appropriate name, localbitcoins.com. It seems to be about more than 1/3 of the time that actually victims use that. Wow. I think the people are dubbing it as a Craigslist of Bitcoins.
Okay.
And the second interesting point to me is 90% of the victims actually they paid single payments. I think probably it's a fear of the loss of data. And whenever a victim is hit with a ransomware, malware or attack, they will be given a unique ID along with the Bitcoin address where to actually money to be posted. So by using these Bitcoin exchanges, the victim will pay the money and actually the bad guys, the hackers actually collect from that specific Bitcoin wallet address. That the crux of the story for me is when they follow this Bitcoin trail, actually 95% of the transactions are leading to BTCE. I think it's a Russian-based cryptocurrency exchange. And they concluded actually, most of the transactions were actually ending at that specific point.
Yeah.
To learn that 95% of the coins ended up, in essence, routing through this clearinghouse or laundering of those Bitcoins is pretty impressive.
Are they doing anything to try to get the people behind this?
2 days before the release of this actually research paper at the DEF CON, I think they arrested one of the key members. I think a couple of billion money laundering, but I don't know whether it created any dent in the market for this specific exchange.
Regardless of this guy being arrested and being able to prove that he basically transacted $4 billion, there are a lot of people on the internet that look at it and say, that's a lot of money. If this guy goes down, I'll be next up to set up the next exchange.
Oh, so you think there's going to be somebody to follow?
Absolutely.
Follow
and like you
quickly
said, they'll just make sure that they figure out what he did wrong, and
Perhaps learn from their
better.
mistakes, right?
I'll do better next time.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Like I say, you also see a lot of these guys. They don't target in the country that they're planning to do the exchange in. So the malware is written to exclude like Russia, or if you're going to do exchange in Russia, so you always have to be extradited to be charged.
So they're basically tracing the signature paths of the Bitcoin and learning more about that. Very clever analysis, and really, I think, helpful in learning more about how this problem is manifesting itself and finding more ways to deter it.
It's not one of those things where you just take one person down and then this problem goes away. I think Bitcoin is certainly here to stay, and I think we're going to see this problem persist.
The reason people are paying it is because of the fear of loss of data. The key is, don't follow the clicks, have a good backup, and also follow the defense in depth policy.
Hey, John. So I hear that you've got a story for us that involves some sort of shenanigans going on in some sort of Turkish app store.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you look at some of the mobile marketplaces, the app stores, because there's so much content, going to another country to get it. For example, if you're in China and you need to get an app that happens to be located in the UK or wherever, some of that download can take a lot of bandwidth and resources. So we start seeing these little pop-up app stores that almost are the sole country's primary app store, and even though they're unofficial. And in Turkey, one of these just recently made the news because every piece of mobile application code on this app store, so everything on it, had malware associated with it. So every one of them was infected. So anyone who used this unofficial app store is now infected with something. So
let's get this straight, John. You're saying 100% of all apps on that app store were.
Yep, 100%. It's an unofficial app store. It's not it's not official. It's not monitored. It's totally off the records. But a lot of people in that country used it because of the it's kind of the easiest mechanism for them to get at. But it goes back to we tell people all the time, use the official app stores. Feel like a broken record. Use the official app stores. Make sure you're running. Make sure when it asks for permissions, you know what you're asking for, what you're giving it, and then it's just common sense. If something doesn't look right, don't use it. And it's just in this case, it's completely unofficial, and it was asking a lot of times permissions that people shouldn't have given it.
As I was reading through the article, the other thing that I saw on there that was interesting was that they had a little bit of a scheme in the beginning, right? Where when you were first getting onto the App Store, they would actually give you 7 days where you actually wouldn't be given the app with the malware on it. So you got a 7-day grace period. Did I get that right? You
got it right. Yeah, I think that's going to be a trend. It kind of lures you in. You think that, I got this for free or I got this cheap, and nothing bad happened.
Right.
You kind of let your guard down a little bit, and boom, they get you.
Right. Yeah. I thought that was interesting. It's like, sure, don't worry about it. Check it out. We're completely 100% legitimate. And it's quite the opposite. We're 100% not legitimate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
John, do you think it's kind of some sort of a test run to doing something even bigger, nefarious thing? I mean, they could have done anything.
Yeah, I think you could. I think in a lot of cases, and I'm sure it's somebody local in that country, but yeah, you just never know what's going to turn into, down the road. And these unofficial app stores do tend to get interconnected at some point. So, they could spread it out, so, if somebody has, is targeting rooted devices, that may be the mechanism that they're going to start using.
Always be wary of where you're downloading your apps from. It's very easy to be enticed by a lower priced app for something that you're looking to do.
The key takeaway is use the official Google stores, maybe official Apple stores to get the patches or apps because they have some stringent policies to vet out the bad apps. Hey John, I think you have a story from Black Hat about Broadcom Wi-Fi chips which is targeting iOS as well as Android devices. Could you elaborate a little bit about on this specific vulnerability?
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, Black Hat's always has some interesting stories that come out of it, and DEF CON as well, of course. And from my perspective in the mobile endpoint, world, probably the most critical one that came out of it is a talk that was titled Broadpwn about an attack against Broadcom chips, the Wi-Fi in particular, and those are used in a number of devices. If you actually look at the piece parts for like Apple devices or Android, a lot of Android device models.
Because we're talking about a Broadcom mobile driver or Wi-Fi driver, we're talking about it sort of affecting both sides of the fence. So iOS devices as well as Android devices, because they both use the same chipsets on their handheld devices.
And what these researchers found was that for Broadcom, the driver for Wi-Fi actually, and it happens all the time, they allocated more space than they actually needed. So the researchers tried to figure out, could I put code into that excess allocation? And what they found was that in some limited circumstances, that extra code, just from the handshake, just saying, hey, is there an AP near me? It would actually be able to be executed as a remote executable. Kind of scary. It's a little limited in the fact that it's local to the Wi-Fi connectivity, but it is a little bit tricky in that regard. Apple's released a patch for this already. Google's released a patch for it already. Devices people should keep their devices up to date. So I don't think that there's going to be a widespread concern. But the researchers even took it to the point where they could say you could turn this into what they call a worm. I don't know if I can call it a worm. I call it more of a virus. But and infect other devices from your device. It's just it's the type of thing that we see out of Black Hat and DEF CON a lot. There's a lot of good research that gets done, and hopefully with good researchers, they're doing a habit of contacting the OEMs, contacting the manufacturers, and making sure that before they give that talk, there's already a patch and it's already corrected, so that nobody's really at risk or risk is minimized.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting one. Do we know, does it say anywhere in the article how much extra, quote unquote, extra space there actually was there? So how much can you actually execute from there?
I'm thinking it's about 140 bytes.
Yeah, which is
what I'm thinking, which is quite a bit.
Yeah, that's quite a bit.
Yeah, so it's enough that you could probably put some good code in there and get it to execute. Now a lot of times the Wi-Fi driver doesn't run at an elevated level. It's at a restricted level. So I don't know what you could actually do with that code. So you might not be able to actually own the device or scrape too much information, depending upon how the permissions are set. But it's more than that anybody would want to have.
John, maybe in the Windows world, basically there are some sort of memory protections to actually thwart these kind of attack, like DEP and ASLR. Those kind of things may mitigate this attack on Wi-Fi world.
Windows is tough to talk about, right? Because there's not a whole lot of footprint there, but you do see some. I'm sure the same problem exists. But it's just different enough that I don't know. I have not seen any research that said that an attack of this nature would be successful in Windows.
Yeah. So interesting thing. I know, like you said before, there were quite a few interesting things that came out of Black Hat and DEF CON. I personally was at DEF CON this year and saw quite a bit myself. So I know that that's just one of a whole mountain of really interesting stories. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks we will end up talking on this show about some of the other interesting things that have come out of both those conferences.
Yeah, and hopefully all of them are the same like this one, already passed.
Right, exactly. In this case, we had responsible disclosure. The researchers who found this disclosed this to both the Android and the Apple side of the house. All right, thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
Hey guys, I know that you like to take the internet weather and really kind of look at what's going on here and now. Yeah. I thought it would be kind of useful, I'm an executive. So I guess it's part of my job to sort of step back and kind of look at the forest through the trees here. So I thought maybe it would be good to kind of step back a little bit. So we're not looking at necessarily here and now, although there's a little piece of it that we'll take a look at. We're going to take a look at the internet weather from what's been kind of going over the last few months here, and see how things are manifesting. The first thing I thought would be kind of useful to take a look at here is, look, this is WannaCry. That really kind of took off on May 13th. So that was sort of the official start date. There was a little bit of activity taking place earlier than that. So I don't know that anybody's really figured out exactly what was going on there, but kind of interesting. So this WannaCry was kind of interesting. But again, this graph ends right around I think it's May 14th is the last date here. So if we take a look at what's going on today, wow, that's kind of interesting to me. So ultimately what we're looking at here is the fact that from the internet point of view at least, there's actually more WannaCry and Petya stuff out, or no Petya stuff hanging out there and continuing to try to find vulnerable systems, and apparently successfully, because we're still seeing an increase in the number of addresses that are impacted by that activity on the internet. So the underlying message here is that even though organizations may feel that that's a come and gone type of issue, the reality is they really need to still be taking care of it, because if perhaps they have some system that's sitting in the corner somewhere that nobody's really paying attention to, and eventually it's going to get discovered and get infected if people aren't paying attention to it. So this is clear evidence. I mean, you can't really argue with that. One of the things that I see is very interesting about this is, and this is very typical when you are looking for activity that might be business related, is that you're seeing activity that's busy during the week and then the weekends are off. That's a typical sort of business cycle activity, suggesting that most of this is impacting businesses and not home users per se. So I think my guess is the reason this is taking place is that for the most part, when home users buy Windows systems, they're automatically configured for Windows Update. The business world is still working a little differently, where they get an enterprise update, they may do some testing, and then they're trying to kind of figure out ways to get it deployed out to all their users. And I suspect that generally speaking, the businesses are actually perhaps doing less of a good job as the consumers are at this point in terms of keeping systems patched. Now, sometimes there are really good reasons for that. Servers, you don't want to break applications because of patches or impact systems and business continuity and things like that. But I think this is really sort of evidence that enterprises should really kind of reconsider how they approach patching and perhaps be more aggressive about it, because clearly that type of activity is still taking place on the internet and continues to spread.
So we could make probably a little bit of a prediction as to where this is going and where it'll eventually settle in, and it's probably going to take this line, if you draw a line across the normal traffic that we'd seen before WannaCry, we're probably going to see a bump, because you're going to have that stuff sitting out there just like the configure stuff for who knows how long. Yeah,
well, this configure stuff dates back to 2008, and I knew there was a period of time where we were tracking, I would say on the order of 4 or 5 times as many devices at a given time. We're reaching a similar number here. Now, since 2008, clearly the numbers of devices on the internet have grown. So it's a little difficult to say where this is going to top out. The curve doesn't seem to be reaching an asymptote at this point. It's not, leveling off or gotten to the point where I would call it saturation. So it's going to be interesting to see how far this goes. And, hopefully it won't get too much worse than this, kind of level out, and then hopefully start working its way down.
Brian sort of tried to really give some context to what this actually looks like. So he had initially showed us sort of a smaller window of what it looked like when we first saw this, but then sort of blew the context out and said, well, what does this look like now, today? And unfortunately, what we saw was that graph basically was skyrocketing, and it doesn't look like it's making any kind of turn to either level off or come down.
So kind of looking at a completely different angle on this, this is sort of our traditional look, and I think we're looking back, let me just take a quick look here. Yeah, it's 30 days. We're looking back 30 days at the And these are the common ports that are probed for IoT devices. So there are a number of ports that are on here that just aren't even showing up in this particular graph. I think what's most notable here is we do have a spike or a sort of resurgence in activity on port 23. Went up from, what are we shown, around 70,000 sources and bumped up to on the order of about 100,000 sources. It's a pretty significant change in activity. But it's interesting to note that there are really only two really active ports here on this now. There's port 22, and we're seeing some, I would say, fairly steady activity here. There's a sort of a botnet event here, and it looks like some tailing off associated with a botnet here. But that's one port that's being targeted, and another one most predominantly is port 23. Some of the other ones where we had seen a reasonable amount of activity, there was a little spike of activity on port 7547. That was the one that was associated with the CPE WAN management protocol. So again, this is 30 days. Let's take a look at a longer period of time, and this is actually looking at the last 2 years, 730 days here. And so just to put it in comparison, we are here today. Actually, that spike takes us up to right about there, compared to, wow, look at where we were.
The trend looking back from now to the past, actually the kind of trend is actually slowed down a little bit.
So I think this is really significant in that when the Mirai botnet was really in its heyday, and that was right around at this point, and we saw, on the order of 500,000 devices, and today we're measuring on the order of about 100,000 devices, it really has decreased in terms of, I think, how, we'll say, aggressively they're scanning the internet. Also sort of point out here, as we just had talked about, port 22 and port 23 are really the only two ports that are really being heavily targeted right now, relatively speaking. Whereas what we were seeing previously is, here's 7547, here's another port which is that's 5358. We saw that associated with some devices. This is a port here. This was 23231, again, associated with another type of IoT device, and then 2323 back here. So the variety of ports being targeted, the amount of targeting activity that's taking place has been going down. But here's an interesting observation. Let's take a look at, and this is over the last year, this is reflective DDoS attack activity. Now, I was having a little trouble creating a same time span, a 2-year graph, so we're going to look at 1 year. But we saw that around the time when the Mirai botnet was getting a little more strength, what ended up happening is they were actually moving away from reflective denial of service attacks and moving toward just sort of brute force attacking. So this downturn should not be considered or construed as a decline in DDoS attack activity. It was actually a decline in using reflective denial of service attacks. And then because the botnet was so darn strong, they didn't really have to do that. Right. They just, let's just flood them. Right. But what's happening now is perhaps because the botnets are smaller, and I don't know if it's that devices are harder to find or they're not being as aggressive or trying to hide a little bit more. But we're seeing more reflective denial of service activity sort of trending upward over the last few months here. This is going back to February, so the last few months we've been seeing some increases in reflective denial of service attack activity again. And it's kind of interesting to point out, controls have been put on the network to control some of these protocols. Like blue here is SSDP. We blocked that on the network because it really doesn't need to be on the internet. It's a LAN protocol. Character generator, that's been blocked. So that's been a pretty good deterrent for those types of vectors. Those are really strong vectors for a period of time. The next one here, port 123, this is network time protocol. And there are some controls that are put in place along those lines but it's not perfect. You can't really block network time protocol on the internet. It's a necessary protocol. Similarly with DNS, DNS being sort of this yellowish one, you can't block DNS on the internet. It would be nice to, in my opinion, to take a look at how DNS is designed to make it more robust to preventing these types of uses. And this last one is really the fragmentation, largely is associated with DNS. So you'll see that the fragmentation curve actually kind of follows the DNS curve quite a bit, partly because what they're doing is trying to create queries that create fragmented responses associated with it. So we're seeing an upward trend in this area. Have been able to put some controls in some of the protocols that aren't aren't needed on the internet or don't really belong on the internet. But we still have some challenges across the industry to be able to get these DDoS attacks under control.
Yeah, some interesting things.
Is that it? It's interesting.
We just saw the end of both the Black Hat and DEF CON conference. I think it's probably justified for us to say here that, to pay attention to the things that are going to, sort of be released after the Black Hat and DEF CON conference for a couple of weeks, maybe even for a couple of months afterwards. You see sort of a rise in sort of the more malicious or more extreme vulnerabilities being exposed. So I would certainly keep an eye out for that and continue to patch whenever possible.